Well, thank you for coming to this. We're going to do, I know you've all been talking a lot about right, AI, data, analytics, modeling. You've seen a lot of the neat tools and things down in the Innovation Hub. So we're just going to take a little bit different tack for the next 45 minutes and go back to some other basics that really help enable a lot of the other things that you all have been talking and sitting in sessions about over the course of the 3 days. So if you think about the reasons that you're here to really think about a guide to quality stewardship and governance, okay? You might be here because maybe you have an organization that is thinking about data governance, or that has a program in place and you've been tasked with doing it. You have no idea what that means. Like, where do you get started? Okay. Or maybe you're sitting there because you're trying to do really cool things, right, in SaaS, and you keep having the same quality issues or data issues again and again and again, okay? So if some of those things don't make sense, maybe some of these do, okay? These are some, I spent a lot of time with customers, with some of Courtney and Andrew's customers here. And something that I like to do is write things down that people tell me, and I have a lot of favorite quotes. These are just a couple of my favorite ones, all right, as we think about that, okay? That we need Rosetta Stone for our data, right? That we're going to have a new governor by the time, Andrew, that was one of our customers. Yep, you remember that one, don't you? We're going to have a new governor by the time we get the answer, okay? So the amount of time it sometimes takes us to get results. My all-time favorite, right, I'm living in spreadsheet hell, because we have all these cool tools, right, and things that, again, that we've been looking at for the past couple of days. Sometimes it seems like it's easier just to pull something into Excel, manipulate it, and be done with it, okay? So if any of these quotes resonate with you, okay, you probably, in your organization, there's some underlying data management challenge that you need to address, okay? And one of the ways that you do that in thinking about managing your data, right, as the asset that it is for your organization, is you really think about those 3 key inputs, okay, which are quality, stewardship, and governance, okay? And so I'm going to walk you through some examples of each of these things. They're key inputs into anything that might be called data strategy, okay? And that's a very broad term. I have to apologize for my voice. I had a cold like a week ago, but it's getting better. So let's start with the first piece, which is really data quality. And so when I talk about data quality, my definition of data quality means different things to different people, okay, depending on how and when they interact with data, okay? But it really is conformance of data, right, to the business definitions, really to the metadata. And I am not going to do a huge talk about metadata and definitions, but I will tell you that if we talk about quality, okay, with no metadata or no definition, okay, quality is anecdotal at best. It's one person's opinion, okay? So I'm assuming business definitions, okay? So I like to think of data quality really in four components or 4 facets. When we talk about, again, the definition, so the context of the data that we're talking about. When we talk about columns, okay, so the columns in a spreadsheet or in a data set, so really the elements themselves, okay? Then the grouping of elements, right, into a record or the rows. And then one thing that often gets left out of the equation is how data moves through an organization. Okay, so really those four pieces. So if we think about each of those 4 things from an example perspective, let's start with business definition. And we're going to play a little game called What Am I? Okay, what am I? Does that mean anything to anybody in this room? Okay, what if I add something else? A USP and a UFR, does that mean anything? Okay, what if I add some more? We don't know, do we? There, right? Okay, what if I do this? Okay. Right. Uh-huh. Yep. Okay. What if I do this? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, that's under Spain or France, Mexico, Texas. So really, what am I? That USP, right? I represent one of the Six Flags of Texas. But my point here is that without having definitions or understanding rules or valid context, right? We don't have any idea what that means. Okay. So just an example, okay? But definitions are important. And Erin, I thought you were going to get that right away. Okay, all right. She's from Texas, so. Okay, so business definitions. So then if we move on to the elements themselves, okay? If we just look at that data that's up there, what jumps out at any of you in the room here? Yeah? Okay. We think that's a middle initial, right? We don't even really know what that is, right? It's probably a name. We've got probably a date. There's another set of numbers, probably an address. So, right. The format is weird. Mm-hmm. So if we think of then the data element, and it helps a lot when I just put a header on there, doesn't it? Okay. So we do have customer ID. It's weird that we've got, varying number of digits in that. We don't even know that we can take Sherlock's address in there. Our business rules would have to tell us if we're allowed to have international addresses. But again, conformity to the metadata. Okay? Do we have the right data right in the right fields? And are we aligning to rules that are defined? Okay? All right. Does anybody know who George Banks is? You SAS people know. Who is that? Huh. Different one. Yeah. Do you guys remember? Courtney, Andrew, Dan? Yeah. It's father of the bride, Steve Martin. Okay. Samantha Baker? Yes, 16 Candles. And we don't have to talk about Sherlock. Everybody knows who he is. So, all right. So if we start putting, again, these fields together then, and we've applied rules, right? We've defined what a valid data element looks like, and now we want to begin to put them together. Well, we can do it here when we start thinking about the columns. What jumps out at you here in these three records? Okay. Phone number. Do we even have enough to know who the joker, or have enough data to think about the joker? Yep. Yeah, right, is that valid? Oh my, did you just out him? Yeah. Yeah, so when we talk about conformance to metadata, right, is a record complete? Some of you called that out, okay? Do we have enough data to use that record, okay? Right, and again, right, somebody somehow needs to define what that acceptance looks like, okay? Do we have records that we might need to merge together? Okay, again, Batman and Bruce Wayne. And then more than likely, the 713 phone number is a more contactable phone number than the bat signal with the hashtag. And then another way to look at that also is if we have a record, can we have a balance of something maybe without a deposit, maybe in another table, so you could be looking across tables or across data sets as well for validation. Okay, makes sense? All right, so then data's moving. And this picture up here is of a garment factory, okay? And if you think of like my pair of pants that I'm wearing, and someone's gonna lay it out, and then it's gonna get sewn together, they put the seams, and then it's gonna get double checked. And then it's gonna move to the next station where they might do the hemming on it, and make these pants petite for me. And then somebody's gonna check it again. And then it might go where they put the labels and things in. But they're checking this garment as it moves through the factory floor. And your data needs to do the same thing. Because quite often, right, we get data and we have a data set and we do something to it. And maybe we add something to it or we augment it. And maybe we ship it to somebody else. And now what do? They do the same thing. And then they send it to somebody else. And then everybody comes to the same meeting and they have different sales numbers, right? Or we're making different decisions in our models, okay? And so it's important that as data moves through the ecosystem, that we're double checking it along the way to make sure we're not changing, right, the elements, the records, right, or even the definition, okay? Does that make sense so far? Okay, so somebody has to keep an eye on all of this, okay? And that becomes the role, right, of the data steward. Do any of you have formal data stewards in your organizations? Congratulations, okay? And
you have formal ones, but they're also, that's part of their day job.
Exactly.
They'll raise their hand if there's an issue, but they're not
formal-ish, right? And so what I've seen in my experience is that data stewards typically are in an organization. Really, it's the job that they do at 4:45, right, on Friday afternoon, right? Okay, so it really is data governance as a courtesy, right? Not something that's a formality in most organizations, right? And so when we think of data stewards then, so when we think of what a data steward does, right, they are really somebody who, right, takes care of a valuable resource. And my best example, this is my favorite national park, but if we think of, right, like a park ranger, right, taking care of, right, our nation's assets for us. And then conversely, a data steward then really works to help develop, right, the data assets for the organization. And, that can be usage, questions, rules, any of those types of things, quality, okay? And so so data stewards have a long to-do list, okay? And those that raised their hands and said they were data stewards, I think you get that, right? So when we think of a day in the life, what a data steward does, they do everything from helping to manage key terms, right? From thinking about what are our business rules, what business rules do we need to apply, right, to make data more usable for end users. They might define what quality looks like, working with their business partners or constituents, okay? They are probably the folks that are also going to measure compliance to those rules, okay? They do a lot. They might also profile data, which is probably one of the most underrated but best practices, right, to think from a data quality perspective is to understand. So if you think of profiling, it's really looking at the characteristics of a data set. So, right, do you have if you're thinking of state, that's the best example. You might want 50, if you're looking at US states, that all have 2 characters. If you have some that have 4, right, and that you can, actually down on the hub, they can show you. Got it, okay, same thing, yep, right, okay. But that's a lot on somebody's plate at 4:45 on Friday afternoon, right? So, and does this resonate with y'all that are stewards? So I believe it takes a special kind of person that has some characteristics to really do this role and do all of those things, especially in addition to their day job, right? And so data stewards really are folks that can collaborate in the organization, whether they're working, right, up, down, or across with their peer groups. They're folks that can speak to IT folks and speak to business folks, regardless of which organization they live in, okay? They are folks that have a level of tenacity to solve problems, okay? They're not gonna just create the little workaround and then do it again next month. No, they wanna solve the problem, right, for end users, okay? And they have a level of influence in the organization, okay? So really, again, they're good problem solvers. Do you know people like this in your organizations? Yeah, it's you. So, okay. So in thinking about building a program, again, to help think about definitions and quality, you want to build a program around this role, okay? And this role formally. And so there are several models or ways that you can think about doing that, okay? And these are the most popular ones in a lot of organizations. It turns into some hybrid look. But if we think of data subject areas, right? Like person or customer, location, product, okay? Right? People that are very, very focused and understand that data, okay? So we might build a program around data subject areas, okay? We may build a program around functions, okay? You know, like what are we doing in finance, in financial services? So maybe we're gonna, someone's going to apply for a loan. We're going to make a decision on a loan. Then we're going to do a product offering. And then we're going to onboard a loan, right? As functions, people that understand those different processes or in departments, okay? We may build programs around applications or systems, okay? And applications, as we all know, can be very large. So that can be a very large undertaking. I actually group analytic platforms, right, in the applications or systems, because that's a place that a lot of people tend to interact with data, right? And a lot of data quality issues, right, are usually raised because somebody sees something that doesn't look right in a report, okay? And then lastly, there's projects, okay? Right, so maybe we're gonna think about having a data steward that's assigned to a project, maybe based on what that project is, okay? So each of these models have some pluses and some cons, so pros and cons, pluses, minuses, okay? I promise you that I am not gonna read this next slide to you. They're available on the site, or you can contact me and I'll send them to you. But there are some things to think about with each of the models, okay? And then each of the models, it really is what's important to your organization, okay? Because there are some things in some organizations that work. Like if you're in the public sector, if you're working on something that's not funded, you're not working on it, okay? It has to be funded. So then funding is going to be very important to you, okay? There are some things that maybe the reporting structure is very important to you. Like data stewards need to report to the person, right? So they have to have a line of sight to their manager to make things happen. So, and then I added some mitigation strategy if something's important to you, but you're not doing it. So, for example, okay, if it's important that you have a lot of business orientation, okay, then data governance objectives, right? They need to be aligned to business objectives, okay? And if you're not, then really having a clearly defined IT or data strategy can help mitigate that, right? So, other examples, right? Again, I just talked about that existing org structure, right? That you have the expertise already established. Usually that's around applications or systems, right? Or processes, right? That sometimes we want to have an enterprise perspective, right? Not just thinking about governance in silos, right? Again, I talked about the funding, right? Having something that has clearly defined ownership, okay? That there's a lot of maybe customer data that's used across systems might be important. That there's an end date, right? That we know when something's going to roll off or close out, or that we have consistency in processes. So again, each of the models has some pluses and minuses, and you can all take this back and look at it in your organization and think, okay, well, which ones are good and which ones aren't? Well, you know what? At the end of the day, they're all about the same. And this is Mary Ann's opinion, by the way, of how things roll, right? So, for example, the funding one is the closest one for me to touch, or the farthest one. So if funding's important to you, right, that a project is probably the best place to start, because projects, they have funding, okay? But a con for having a project is, having a defined lifetime. Projects end. So if you create a program or a processes for data governance in the context of a project, okay? I've seen it work, but you also have to plan for something to work beyond the end date of a funded project, okay? Does that make sense? So again, you can use this as a grid or as a guide, right, to thinking about building your program. Because that takes us to the next part and the meat of this. So if we really are talking about right, common definitions to help us solve data quality problems, putting some oversight or some stewardship around quality, then how do we know that all this is happening, and how are we formally instilling that discipline? And that really is through data governance, right? And so when we think about data governance, really, that is that organizational structure, right, for establishing strategy around shared data, okay? In other words, it really is that organization or that process for instilling discipline, right, in how we're going to manage data, right, and manage our data management processes or oversee them, okay? So now we're going to build, there's a lot of white space here. So we're going to build out a framework together for doing this. And we're going to start with data governance. And I believe that the most important components of thinking about planning or designing a program are really in those 5 boxes that are up there, okay? So really objectives, decision-making, defined roles and responsibilities, okay? Policies and procedures, and then one that quite often gets left out is communication, right? The customer that I was just with, they're actually doing a pretty good job, and they had me come in and assess what they've been doing, and nobody knows what they've been doing because they don't communicate anything. You guys, your problems are pretty easy to solve. Let's just start putting stuff out there. And so let's start then with objectives, okay? Objectives are the most important piece and component of starting your program. If you can't define an objective, then you don't know what you're doing, and you end up kind of data governance, the whack-a-mole game, okay? You don't, right? So, and we've all been there. And so objectives, you really need to think about what is it that we want to achieve, right? And how are we going to measure it? And there's an example up there. So we want to increase the consistency, availability, usability, and quality of internal and external data. I know there's a lot of commas there. This is how this customer decided to write this objective, okay? But it's something that we can measure against and that we could define roles and responsibilities around, okay? And then along with program objectives, I also like to think about guiding principles or guardrails for a program. And so really how do we want our program to operate? And then if we have questions about why are we doing something a certain way, maybe we have something to go back and look at and read. And an example might be that data governance will be facilitated centrally, right, executed locally. So maybe out in the different departments or by different data domains. But we're going to have common processes, right? So again, they're just they're squishier, and we're not measuring against them, but they're really just that beacon, or like I said, they're the guardrails, okay? But objectives are important. And when I go and talk with customers, and the first thing I ask them is, do you have objectives? If they don't, that's automatically their starting point, okay? So decision-making, okay? What is it that we're asking people to do, right? But we have to be able to draw a picture of it first, okay, from an organizational structure perspective. And so this is an example of, right, somewhere someone has to sponsor the program. Someone has to support the program, okay? Whether that's offering funding or the time for people to do their jobs, right? So that it's not a courtesy, it's not the 445 job, okay? Somebody needs to provide the oversight, okay? And again, these are more roles. It doesn't mean that we have one individual doing these things, right? And then somebody actually needs to do the work. So from an operational perspective, so there's the data stewardship role, right? Right, in tandem with data management, right? Which we'll talk about in a minute. And then the solutions really help us with automation and repeatability, okay? Reusability, okay? And then we don't want to forget also that somebody has to facilitate the program, okay? From a program management perspective, from a communication perspective, okay? So these are the different roles that again, need to be addressed. Now, I've been in organizations where, right, sponsor or support and oversight are the same, okay? Where actually stewardship and data management are the same, where governance and stewardship are the same. It really is dependent on your organization, okay? But these are really the things, though, that need to get done. Because you can take that and you think about that, then you can draw a picture of what your organizational structure might look like. So this is an example. So this committee, and I don't get hung up on what we call these. This is what this customer called this. They had a steering committee that was actually already made up of their executives. And all we did was increase their charter by 15 minutes a quarter, providing, right, the support. And then they had a council, which was that data governance piece, okay? And then they had, again, remember that guiding principle that said we're going to manage, essentially execute locally. So this was a very domain-specific model where there were assigned data owners. And again, sample domains might be customer, product, location, right? Right, patient, provider, student, right? And so data owners had the organizational authority to appoint data stewards and small working groups to solve very specific problems, okay, in the context of their domain. So their box that's here, okay? And then the program management function, right, worked across the different domains, okay? And then data management, the data management team, that was a shared service, okay? But you need to be able to draw what your picture, because when you start telling people, congratulations, you're now a part of data governance, and this is your role, they want to be able to put their finger somewhere, and that's the only one I can reach, that's the one I'm touching, and say, this is, like, what does that mean to me? So that's the next thing that you need to be able to do is to write your sentences. So if I'm part of this council, what am I doing? Oh, I'm accountable for oversight of data assets, right? And I'm made up of data owners, which means I'm probably a data owner or in charge of a domain, okay? This doesn't take care of detailed roles and responsibilities, but designing your program, this gets you started, okay? All right? It gets people a flavor for what they're going to be doing, okay? And so, again, when we think of the next piece, because this is really what data governance does, especially out of the gate, is thinking about policies and processes. And people always ask me, Marianne, what does that mean? What does a data governance policy looks like? So remember our objective, which was increasing the availability, usability, quality, right, of data. And so this was this customer's policy statement, okay? They said that the governance office, that's what they called it there, and then they went on to say, like, in partnership, right, with the appropriate, whoever's out in the business, and IT will, and this was the most important word for them, which is why it's in red. They said, we will proactively, okay, assess, monitor, report, and improve data quality, right? And I know there's a lot, again, a lot of commas, that's how they chose to write it. And then they went on to say, and you've already heard me say this, that for the purposes of this policy, they define data quality as what? Conformance to the business made of data, okay? So 2 sentences, and then there were some procedures, right, and standards that went along with this. But this 2 sentences, okay? But it really set the tone for how they were, and this was a customer that was adopting SaaS, and this really set the tone for how they were going to utilize, right, the tools that they were investing in, okay? So that at the end of the day, they were getting better results from better analytic results, okay? All right. And then the last piece, communication. And again, this one's important because this gets left out of most programs, right? So you need to be able to define, right, from just even writing this down, okay, what messaging do we need to send out to our organization? So what's important to them, okay? And then why are we sending it? Who are we sending it to, right? Who's writing it? This is usually a program management function. How often are we sending it? And I'm telling you that if we're going to tell our leadership that we're going to be updating them on our program, on whatever we define as a regular basis, we need to send them updates on that regular basis, okay? And then how we're going to communicate with them. And some things that we might want to send out, right? Maybe a program scorecard. How are we doing against our policies? How compliant are we? Maybe there's a data quality scorecard to show that we're improving something, okay? And maybe we're going to be communicating what we mean when we say data governance or data quality or metadata or data stewardship, right? All of those words that people start hearing and then again, they internalize and now they've got their own definition for it. We might share our policies, maybe meeting minutes. Again, every organization is a little bit different, but that's a good starting point, okay? But it's something, don't forget this and leave this out, okay? So data governance then. Really, again, thinking about policies so that we can put data management processes in place. And when I think about data management, it really is, right, a set of capabilities. So metadata, data quality, data architecture, so that's everything from modeling to movement, right, if you're doing, right, ETL, security, so protecting data, administering data, so just the DBA type activities, the entire life cycle from the birth to the death of a record, all right? If we're going to manage master or reference data, okay? And then our analytics, our data analytics gets its own little box. And so we can think about policies and processes, right, for all of these little boxes, right, to get to better outcomes. And again, depending on what your challenge areas are, okay, again, usually people start thinking about data management or data governance because they're looking at a report, right, that data analytics box down there, and then they start thinking about quality and they've got to back into metadata. Okay. And so data management then, data governance, data management really working in tandem. And we talked about data stewardship already. I really like to think of them as the conduit between data governance and data management. Okay? And again, really thinking about policies, about profiling, definitions, okay? And then we don't do any of this just to do it, okay? We need to align our data governance program and make sure that we're aligned to overall business objectives. And those boxes that are up there, those are really the ones that, when people start throwing out challenge areas, it usually is in one of those boxes up there. And those are also typically the things that our leadership cares about. And you can substitute, wherever your specific industry or, your business is focused on, customer could be a different word. It could be patient, provider, student, consumer, okay? But everybody wants to understand how customers interact with the products and services that we sell. Right? And so from there, we can think about solutions then, because again, the solutions, okay, when I was talking about data management, those were really capabilities. The solutions, and again, the things that you all have been looking at in the Innovation Hub, again, can really help you from a data management perspective, really automate, right, speed up, and provide repeatability, right, in your results, okay? All right, and then the last part of this framework is really around methods. So how do we implement an organization like this? And I just want to throw just a couple of notes out there. Remember, there's that framework that we talked about a minute ago. But really, when you think about operationalization, I know that's a long word, of data governance, really, it's not a magic, right, just like the easy button at Staples, okay? It takes discipline and it takes work to really instill discipline in how we manage data formally, okay? And then if we're going to think about developing policies, they may turn into some other change in the organization that could be related to the people, it could be related, the organizational structure, to processes, right, to technology, right? Because maybe we don't have the right technology to help us automate, right, some of our processes, okay? So I just wanted to, and then there's also going to be interactions with other teams or groups that are out there in our organization. And so as you're thinking about implementing this then, because that if you just went and said, okay, this is us now, that's a lot of change in a very short amount of time. And so we need to be very thoughtful about how we do this. So for example, this customer I worked with, we started with the program management function because we already had a gentleman named Van who was going to be the program manager for data governance. Phew, that was easy. And that organization already had a data architecture team in place that was working on a data strategy. So we actually formalized some of the things that they were doing, okay? Their steering committee, they already had an executive group. So we took this whole plan to them and got them to, had them bless it, right? We expanded, again, their charter a little bit. And then actually the communication then went from them to appoint the first data owner, okay? Again, that data owner, this organization had the organizational authority to appoint data stewards and working groups, okay? And then after we stood up that domain, then the next domain, right, the council we had, okay? So again, it's just, you just need to be thoughtful about how you implement this structure, okay? So just some closing, one last thing here, some verbs. Data governance does what? We establish policies and standards, right? With a lot of et cetera. That does what? Determines what we're going to do from a data management perspective, okay? And then we don't want to forget our data stewards then who recommend and monitor, right, policies on behalf of the organization, okay? So there's the big boxes, and I hope you all appreciate that I just didn't throw that up in front of you, okay? But you're welcome to use it, and a lot of customers have found this picture helpful to them because it gets it all on one page. And so some key takeaways when we think about data quality, again, conformance to metadata, okay? And then if we're thinking end-to-end metadata, had those 4 components, okay? When we think about data stewardship, okay, it needs to be formal, not as a courtesy anymore. And then really think about designing a framework around data stewardship, right? It's a key role. And then lastly, right, data governance operationalization, I can't say that word, it is, really requires planning and diligence. And again, defined objectives are key. They really drive everything from activities, policies, processes, roles, and responsibilities. They really drive everything. So don't forget those things. Here are a couple helpful links. Oops. That's to my website, and I did write a book on this topic. And then that takes us to our end, and we have some time for some questions. Do we have a couple of minutes? 5 minutes. And then I can meet people outside if there's anything you want to talk about. Does anybody have questions? Uh-huh. I have a couple of packages, and so I do like a workshop setting thing that I can do in 2 days. It'll just get you started. I have a bunch of modules that from everything from a little bit of everything that I touched on here, but more detail. And then that can be done in a day and a half or 3 half-day sessions. And then after that, anything like 4 to 8 weeks to get somebody kind of going, or longer if you need more support. So, okay. Oh, yes. I think they typically fail because when the funding runs out, and this is mostly in government, so funding runs out and the person that was kind of driving data governance moves on to the next project. And so they've got to account for all of their time, right? So and that is typically the reason. But the other thing too is that you might also have like multiple projects. Now they're not, and that was another minus for consistency in that project, is that one project does something one way, and then another group of people are doing something a different way. And now they clash and people just go back to their old habits. So, but right? Formalization, right? And writing things down and getting consistent with what you're doing, right? Really pays off in the long run. So hope that helped. So, okay. All right. Y'all enjoy I don't know if the party tonight. So, so thank you for coming. So,